Evelyn Turner had always felt the weight of expectations on her shoulders, even when she was a child. From the moment she could remember, her life had been mapped out for her by her parents. She was the only daughter of David Turner, one of New York's most influential businessmen, and his wife, Grace, a socialite whose reputation was just as immaculate as her perfectly manicured nails. They expected nothing less than perfection from her in every aspect of her life. Her grades were to be flawless, her behavior exemplary, and her future, of course, was to be planned out with the utmost precision. Her childhood was a constant blur of parties, charity events, and high society gatherings where Evelyn learned early on that appearances were everything. There was no room for weakness, no room for failure. She learned to smile in front of the camera, to say the right things to the right people, and to never, ever disappoint her parents. They had never been cruel or intentionally hurtful, but their expectations, driven by their own unyielding desire for status and power, were suffocating. Now, at 24, Evelyn found herself standing at the precipice of the life her parents had so carefully designed for her. The future had always been mapped out: marry well, secure the family's legacy, and maintain the image of the perfect, accomplished daughter. The problem was, Evelyn had no interest in the life her parents had chosen for her. They had arranged everything down to the smallest detail: her education, her social circle, even her future husband. Blake Harrington, the son of a prominent family in Manhattan, had been chosen as her future partner. Blake was everything her parents wanted in a son-in-law: wealthy, well-connected, and charming in a way that made everyone like him on the surface. But Evelyn knew the truth. Blake was arrogant, controlling, and uninterested in her as a person. He was only interested in the status their marriage would bring him. Evelyn had met him a few times over the years, and though he smiled and spoke the right words, she had never felt any connection to him. She could see through his polished exterior to the selfish man beneath. Evelyn had spent months trying to avoid the inevitable. She had told herself that if she just worked hard enough, if she kept her head down and avoided confrontation, maybe her parents would relent. Maybe they would see that she didn't want to be another pawn in their carefully constructed game. But it didn't matter how hard she tried to steer her life in a different direction, her parents were determined to marry her off to Blake. The evening of her 24th birthday arrived, and with it, the culmination of all her parents' plans. A grand celebration had been arranged at their Upper East Side mansion. It was a night that should have been about Evelyn, about celebrating her coming of age, but instead, it felt like another staged performance. The guests, a mix of high-profile business people, socialites, and wealthy friends, milled around the ballroom, their laughter and polite conversation filling the space. Evelyn felt like an actor, playing a role she had long since grown tired of. As she stood by the grand piano, scanning the room for any sign of escape, her mother appeared at her side. "Evelyn, darling," Grace said, her voice smooth and unwavering. "Why don't you go say hello to Blake? He's over by the bar. I'm sure he'd love to talk to you." Evelyn's stomach tightened. She didn't want to talk to Blake. She didn't want to pretend that everything was fine. But her mother's smile was tight, insistent. It was the same smile that had pushed her through every uncomfortable moment in her life. The smile that always said, "This is what's best for you." "I'm sure he'll be waiting," Evelyn replied, her voice forced as she turned away. She walked across the room, her heels clicking against the marble floor, her heart pounding in her chest. Blake stood by the bar, a drink in hand, laughing with a group of men in sharp suits. When he saw Evelyn approaching, his smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "Evelyn," he said, his voice smooth and practiced. "I've been looking for you." "I'm here," she replied, her eyes meeting his, trying not to show the annoyance that had built up inside her. Blake didn't seem to notice. He took her hand and placed a kiss on her knuckles, his gaze never leaving hers. "I'm looking forward to the future," he said, his tone confident, almost smug. "Everything is falling into place, just as we've always planned." Evelyn forced herself to smile, but inside, she felt sick. Everything he said was true, and that was the problem. Their entire lives had been planned out, their futures intertwined before either of them had a say in it. Evelyn couldn't help but feel like she was suffocating under the weight of her family's expectations. "I'm sure you're right," she said softly, not trusting herself to say anything else. She pulled her hand away from his grip, giving him a tight smile before stepping back. "I'm going to take a moment to gather myself," she added, walking away before he could protest. She found herself retreating to the quiet of the balcony. The cool night air hit her face, and she closed her eyes, trying to steady her racing thoughts. She had spent her entire life trying to be what her parents wanted her to be, but the thought of marrying Blake, of living a life that was predetermined for her, was more than she could bear. Her mind raced. She couldn't go through with this. She had to leave. But where would she go? She had no friends outside of her family's circle. She had no idea how to survive without their money and connections. The thought of leaving everything behind terrified her, but it was the only way she could imagine finding any freedom. She took a deep breath, gathering her courage, when the sound of footsteps broke through her thoughts. She turned, startled, only to find her father, David Turner, standing behind her. His expression was stern, as always. "Evelyn, what are you doing out here?" he asked, his voice low and authoritative. "I needed some air," she replied, not meeting his eyes. He didn't press her further, but his gaze hardened. "You know what's expected of you, don't you? This is for the good of the family, for your future. I don't understand why you're making this harder than it has to be." Evelyn's heart dropped. She had been trying so hard to be everything they wanted her to be, but now, standing before her father, she realized that nothing would ever change. She would never be allowed to make her own choices. "I can't do this, Father," she said, her voice trembling. "I can't marry Blake. It's not my life to live. It's not my choice." David's face darkened. "You don't have a choice in this matter. We've worked too hard to get you where you are. You will marry Blake, and you will do your duty to this family. That's the way it's always been." Tears welled in Evelyn's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She couldn't stand the idea of a life she didn't choose for herself. She felt trapped, suffocated by the expectations of everyone around her. This wasn't the future she wanted. It wasn't the life she had dreamed of. "I'm sorry, Father," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But I can't do this anymore." Without another word, she turned and fled the balcony, pushing through the crowded ballroom, her heart pounding in her chest. Her parents' voices echoed in her mind, but she didn't stop. Evelyn didn't know where she was going. She simply walked, her footsteps quick and erratic, as if the rhythm of her feet could outrun the chaos swirling inside her mind. The grand mansion she had grown up in, the one she had always thought was a sanctuary, now felt like a prison. The weight of her father's words hung over her like a dark cloud, suffocating any remaining hope she had of escaping her predetermined life. She needed to get away. She needed space to breathe, to think, to make sense of everything that had just happened. She slipped through the side door of the mansion, stepping into the cool night air. The city stretched out before her, endless streets lit by street lamps, the distant hum of traffic a faint reminder of the world outside her gilded cage. Evelyn had always known that Manhattan was vast, but tonight, it felt like an ocean, vast and impersonal, offering no answers, only the illusion of freedom. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, but she ignored it. It was most likely another message from her mother, asking where she had gone or if she was ready to come back inside. As if everything could be solved with a simple apology. Evelyn didn't have the strength to respond to her mother's pleas for understanding. She didn't have the words to explain how trapped she felt, how suffocated she was by the life her parents had created for her. Instead, she kept walking, her mind racing. She couldn't go back. Not now. Not when the entire foundation of her life had just crumbled beneath her feet. Her shoes clicked sharply on the sidewalk as she moved through the streets of the city. She passed by upscale shops and restaurants, but none of them felt familiar anymore. The world around her seemed to be in motion, bustling with people who appeared to know exactly where they were going, while she was adrift, lost, unsure of what came next. Her phone buzzed again, but this time, she stopped. She had to take a breath. She needed a moment to steady herself. Pulling her phone from her bag, she glanced at the screen. A text from Blake: "We need to talk. It's time to stop playing games. Your parents are expecting us at the party tomorrow night. Don't make me wait." Evelyn stared at the message for a long moment, her thumb hovering over the screen. He was so certain of what he wanted, so sure that everything could be wrapped up in a neat little bow. But Evelyn wasn't sure of anything anymore. How could she be? Every part of her had been molded into someone else's idea of who she should be, and she didn't know how to break free. She pressed her phone to her chest, the weight of it almost unbearable. She needed answers. But she didn't know where to find them. Her mind wandered to the last conversation she'd had with Mason Clark, the man who had stepped in when she had nowhere else to go. Mason. He had appeared out of nowhere, offering her a place to stay and a safe space to think. At first, she had been hesitant, afraid of trusting someone she barely knew. But in the short time she had spent with him, something had shifted. Mason wasn't like the men her parents surrounded her with, men who saw her as a means to an end, a piece of the social puzzle they had to arrange. Mason had offered her kindness without expectation, a sense of freedom without strings attached. It was a strange thought, but Mason's world seemed so far removed from the life she had always known. She remembered the way his house had felt, a place that didn't seem to demand anything from her, where the air didn't feel thick with expectations. She thought about the way he had listened to her when she needed someone to hear her, without judgment. Maybe, just maybe, he could be the one person who could help her find a path forward. Evelyn pulled her coat tighter around her and looked around, uncertain of where to go. She couldn't keep walking aimlessly around the city, trying to outrun her thoughts. She needed to make a decision. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was her father. She didn't even bother opening the message. She already knew what it would say: please to come home, to come back to the life she had known. She was tired of the words. She was tired of being told what was best for her. Without another thought, she turned around and started walking back the way she came. The decision had been made. She was done pretending. She was done living a life that wasn't hers. The car ride to Mason's place was long and silent, the driver's face impassive as he navigated through the streets. Evelyn leaned her head against the window, watching the city lights blur as the car moved steadily through the night. It was strange to think that just a few days ago, she had been at the height of her life, surrounded by luxury, by people who saw her as nothing more than a piece in their game of social power. And now, here she was, sitting in the back of a car, heading toward the only place she could think to go. She didn't even know if Mason would welcome her. After all, he had been kind to her, but he hardly knew her. The car finally stopped outside the large, dark mansion that Mason owned. Evelyn looked at the front door, her heart in her throat. She was about to step into a new chapter of her life, but she had no idea what it would hold. She stepped out of the car and walked up to the front door, her heels clicking softly against the stone path. When the door opened, she was greeted by the butler, who gave her a polite smile. "Miss Turner," he said, as though he knew her name by heart. "Mr. Clark is expecting you. Right this way." The inside of the mansion was just as grand as she remembered, but there was something about the way it felt tonight, something different. It wasn't suffocating, as her parents' house always felt. There was an openness here, a sense of possibility. She followed the butler down the long corridor, her mind racing as she tried to figure out what she would say to Mason when they finally spoke. The butler led her to the drawing room, where Mason was seated by the fire. When he saw her, his expression softened, and for the first time since she had arrived, Evelyn felt a glimmer of hope. "I didn't think you'd come," he said, standing up. "I wasn't sure if I was the right person to turn to." Evelyn smiled weakly, her hands trembling. "I didn't know where else to go." I thought, maybe you'd be the one person who didn't expect anything from me. Mason's eyes softened. You're welcome here, Evelyn. You don't have to explain anything to me. Just take a breath. Evelyn took a deep breath, feeling the weight she had carried for so long begin to lift. There was no immediate solution to her problems, no perfect way forward, but in this moment, she realized that she wasn't alone anymore. She wasn't trapped in a world of other people's expectations. For the first time in what felt like years, Evelyn allowed herself to feel something other than fear. She felt the warmth of Mason's home, the gentleness of his presence, and the quiet comfort of knowing she had made a choice, for herself. And though she had no idea what the future held, Evelyn was ready to face it, one step at a time. The days following Evelyn's arrival at Mason's mansion were a whirlwind of mixed emotions. She had walked into his home, unsure of what she was looking for or what she would find, but the peace that had settled over her in the first few hours was like nothing she had ever known. She had expected her life to feel like a whirlwind, but instead, it felt as though she had stepped into a sanctuary, away from the noise, away from the expectations, and into a place where she could simply breathe. Mason had given her space to settle in, respecting her need for solitude. He didn't push her to talk about the decisions she had made, nor did he offer advice that she wasn't ready to hear. Instead, he quietly let her adjust to this new world that was so different from everything she had known. The mansion was large and impressive, with high ceilings, expansive rooms, and a grand library that seemed to call to her every time she passed by. But despite the grandeur of the house, it didn't feel cold or impersonal. There was warmth in the way Mason had organized it, subtle touches of art, carefully chosen furniture, and personal items that made the house feel like a home. In the evenings, Mason would often join her for dinner. They ate in silence at first, each lost in their own thoughts. But as the days passed, they began to talk more, about everything and nothing. Evelyn found herself drawn to his calm demeanor, to the way he didn't rush her or pressure her into decisions. There was no urgency in his presence, no demand for anything in return. It was refreshing, almost alien, in a world that had always been about performance and expectation. She had never known someone who seemed content with simply letting things unfold. Over time, Evelyn began to open up to him, though it was a slow process. One evening, after a particularly quiet dinner, she found herself speaking about her parents for the first time since leaving. It was not an easy subject, and the words came hesitantly, as though they were heavy and difficult to release. I've spent my entire life trying to please them, Evelyn said, her voice soft as she stared down at her plate. No matter what I did, it was never enough. I always had to be the perfect daughter, the perfect heiress. They never asked me what I wanted, only what they wanted from me. Mason watched her with steady eyes, his silence urging her to continue. She felt the warmth of his gaze, like a lifeline. I thought that if I kept doing what they wanted, if I kept following their rules, I could make them proud. But now, I feel hollow. Like there's nothing left of who I am. It's all been for them, for their expectations. Mason didn't immediately respond. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the city skyline. Evelyn's eyes followed him, noticing the way his silhouette seemed to hold an air of quiet strength. After a few moments, he turned back to her. You've been carrying their weight for far too long, he said, his voice steady but gentle. You've lived your life for them. But you're not a reflection of their dreams. You're your own person, Evelyn. You have the right to choose your own path. His words, simple but profound, struck a chord deep within her. She had never allowed herself the luxury of considering her own desires, her own path, because it had always been overshadowed by her parents' demands. But now, as Mason's words echoed in her mind, she realized just how much she had sacrificed in the name of duty. For the first time, she allowed herself to truly question everything, the life she had been living, the people who had shaped her existence, and the future that had been thrust upon her. A future that had nothing to do with her. I don't know who I am anymore, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what I want. I thought I was doing the right thing all along. But I was just, living for them. Mason's expression softened, and he stepped closer, his voice low and sincere. You don't have to have it all figured out right away, Evelyn. It's okay to be uncertain. You've spent so much time trying to live up to others' expectations that you've forgotten to ask yourself what you want. Evelyn nodded, the weight of his words sinking in. It was liberating, in a way, to hear someone tell her it was okay not to have all the answers. It was okay to take a step back, to find herself. But it was also terrifying. She had spent so many years doing what was expected of her, that the thought of striking out on her own felt like stepping into the unknown. I don't even know where to begin, she said quietly. Mason's response was a gentle smile. That's the beauty of it. You don't have to have a plan right now. You just need to start somewhere. And I'm here to help you, however you need. His offer was more than just words. It was a promise, a commitment that, even though she didn't have all the answers, she didn't have to navigate this journey alone. Over the next few days, Evelyn began to take small steps toward rediscovering herself. She spent time in Mason's expansive library, reading books she had never had the chance to explore before. She walked through the quiet gardens surrounding the mansion, allowing herself moments of peace that she hadn't known in years. And most importantly, she spent time with Mason, who never pushed her but always offered a steady presence in her life. His support was unwavering, and she began to trust him in ways she hadn't trusted anyone else. One afternoon, as the sun began to set, Evelyn sat by the large windows in the drawing room, looking out over the city. She had spent the day reflecting on everything that had brought her to this point. The life she had left behind, the man she was supposed to marry, and the future she had been expected to embrace. But now, sitting here in the stillness of the mansion, she realized that none of it mattered anymore. Mason came into the room, his footsteps quiet on the hardwood floors. He paused when he saw her, taking in her contemplative expression. "You're deep in thought," he said, his voice a mix of curiosity and concern. Evelyn turned toward him, meeting his gaze for the first time without the weight of uncertainty hanging over her. For the first time in a long time, she felt like herself, like someone who could make her own choices, who could carve her own future. "I'm starting to see things differently," she said, her voice steady. "I don't know what the future holds, but I think I'm finally ready to find out." Mason smiled, and in that moment, Evelyn realized that the path ahead of her wasn't so terrifying anymore. She didn't know exactly where it would lead, but she was no longer afraid to walk it. She had taken the first step toward freedom, the first step toward being herself. And with Mason's quiet support, she felt like she could take the next one. And the one after that. One step at a time, the days that followed Evelyn's quiet realization felt like a mix of calm and uncertainty. The space she had been given to think, to breathe, was both a blessing and a curse. For the first time in her life, she wasn't living up to anyone else's expectations, and yet, there was still that lingering feeling of confusion. She was free, but she wasn't sure where to go, what to do, or even who she truly was. She spent her days immersed in the mansion's world, taking long walks around the garden, reading books she had never had the time to enjoy, and reflecting on the choices that had led her to this point. But every time she had a quiet moment, her thoughts turned to her family. Her parents. Blake. The life she had left behind. The weight of their absence pressed down on her chest. Her phone, which she had turned off to avoid constant messages from her parents and Blake, lay on the side table by her bed. At first, she had convinced herself that not answering their calls was a form of rebellion, a way of asserting her independence. But as the days dragged on, the silence felt louder. It wasn't just the silence of avoiding her parents' demands. It was the silence of the life she had left behind. And then, one evening, her phone buzzed again, this time from an unknown number. It was a text from her mother: "Your father is furious. You need to come back home. It's not just about the wedding anymore. You're making things worse, Evelyn. Please come back." Evelyn stared at the message for a long time. Her mother's words were coded in a false sense of concern, but Evelyn knew them too well. It was the same manipulation she had faced all her life, the constant pressure to conform, to play her part. She didn't want to go back. She didn't want to face their disappointment or the life they had planned for her. But at the same time, she couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. Maybe I've gone too far, she murmured to herself, her fingers brushing the screen of her phone. Maybe they're right. Maybe I shouldn't have left. Mason, who had quietly entered the room, heard her soft words and approached her from behind. He didn't ask what she was reading, didn't question the message. Instead, he placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, his presence a steady anchor amidst the storm of her emotions. "You're not going back, are you?" he asked quietly. Evelyn turned to face him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "I don't know what to do anymore," she admitted. "I've been avoiding them, but it's like I'm running away from something. Maybe I'm just afraid of being alone, Mason." He smiled softly, his gaze kind. "You're not alone, Evelyn. You've never been alone. You just haven't allowed yourself to see it yet. Your parents may have spent years telling you who to be, but that's not who you are. And Blake, well, Blake is a chapter that needs to be closed." She swallowed hard, biting back tears. "It's hard, Mason. I spent so much of my life trying to meet their expectations. I don't know what's left of me if I stop trying to please them." Mason's eyes softened as he took a seat beside her. He didn't respond immediately, giving her space to process the weight of her words. But then, he turned toward her and said in a voice that was steady but full of conviction, "You've already made the hardest choice, Evelyn. You've chosen yourself. That's something most people never have the courage to do. Your parents have spent your whole life shaping you into something they wanted you to be. But now, you get to decide who you are. And you don't have to do it alone." She looked at him, a mix of gratitude and apprehension in her eyes. "I don't know if I'm strong enough." Mason's gaze never wavered. "You don't have to be strong all the time. You just have to be honest with yourself. And right now, the truth is that you're ready for something different. You've already taken the hardest step by walking away." The silence that followed was comfortable, but filled with a weight of unspoken words. For the first time in a long time, Evelyn didn't feel the pressure to be perfect. She didn't feel the need to have it all figured out. She didn't need the answers yet. All she needed was to take the next step, and the one after that. That evening, as the night drew in, Evelyn and Mason sat together in the cozy library of the mansion. The crackling sound of the fire was the only noise filling the space. The gentle flicker of the flames cast long shadows on the bookshelves, creating a quiet, intimate atmosphere. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, her mind racing with thoughts of what her next move would be. She had no job, no plans, and no direction other than the one she was starting to carve out for herself. It felt like both a blessing and a curse. She had always been someone who liked to have control, but now, in this uncertain moment, she was learning to let go of the need to know everything. Mason was sitting across from her, his focus on a book he was reading. But he could feel her eyes on him, and after a few moments, he looked up. "You don't have to decide everything tonight, Evelyn," he said, his tone quiet but understanding. "Sometimes, the most important decision is simply to let go and trust yourself. You've spent so much of your life trying to fit into someone else's box. You're free now, and that's a gift. But it's also a little scary." Evelyn gave a small, rueful smile. "I never thought I'd be sitting here, in a house like this, with someone I barely know, trying to figure out who I am. It's all so overwhelming." Mason closed his book, setting it aside. "You're doing fine, Evelyn. You've taken the hardest step already. And from here, you just take one day at a time." "I guess that's all I can do," Evelyn murmured, her voice filled with both uncertainty and quiet resolve. "I'm not sure where to start, but I know I don't want to go back to what I had before." Mason nodded. "You won't have to. I'm here to help you however you need. But you also need to make some decisions for yourself, about what you want. This is your life now. Not your parents', not Blake's. Yours. As the night wore on, Evelyn found herself reflecting on his words. She had been running for so long, trying to escape the confines of her past, trying to break free from the chains that had held her down for so long. She had left her family's mansion, but she was still carrying their expectations with her. Now, she had to let go of those expectations, too. She had to trust that she was capable of choosing her own path. She had to be the one to decide what she wanted out of life. The next few days were filled with quiet contemplation. Evelyn spent more time in the library, reading about different paths people had taken to redefine their lives. She wasn't sure what kind of future she wanted yet, but she began to entertain the idea that she could create her own story. The idea of creating something new, of starting fresh, was daunting, but it was also liberating. Mason continued to be a steady presence in her life. He didn't push her, didn't rush her into making decisions. But there was something about his quiet confidence, his unwavering support, that gave her the courage to look forward instead of constantly looking back. By the end of the week, Evelyn knew one thing for sure: she wasn't going back to the life she had known. The road ahead was uncertain, but she was finally ready to walk it. And no matter what came next, she would face it on her own terms. The following week, Evelyn woke up to a world that felt strangely still, as if everything had paused for a moment to give her the space to breathe. The weight of her decisions had begun to settle in, not as an oppressive force, but as a relief. She had finally freed herself from the rigid expectations of her parents, from the suffocating life they had crafted for her. And although she didn't have a clear path ahead, there was a sense of possibility in the air, a feeling she had never allowed herself to embrace until now. She had spent the last few days staying close to Mason's mansion, retreating into the solitude of the home's quiet elegance, but now, she could feel herself growing restless. She had to take the next step, whatever it was, but she couldn't do it alone. She didn't want to make rash decisions in a vacuum. She needed someone who could help her navigate this new life. And so, for the first time since arriving at Mason's home, she decided to take the initiative and ask for his guidance. Evelyn found him that morning in the study, seated at his desk, his attention consumed by a pile of papers. He was always working, always focused on something, but there was an air of ease about him that contrasted with her own feelings of uncertainty. As she approached him, he looked up, offering her one of his quiet, knowing smiles. It was strange how much his calmness had affected her. There was no rush in him, no urgency. He moved at his own pace, as though everything would unfold exactly as it was meant to, and somehow, that gave Evelyn a sense of peace. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice steady but edged with the uncertainty that she could no longer ignore. Mason set down the papers in front of him, his gaze shifting to her with full attention. He didn't respond immediately, allowing her the space to find the words. She appreciated that about him. He wasn't hasty with his advice. There was no judgment in his eyes, no pressure to speak before she was ready. "I'm not sure where to start," Evelyn admitted, sitting down across from him, feeling the weight of her words. "I don't know what I want to do with my life, Mason. It feels like everything I've ever known is gone, and now I'm just lost. I thought I would feel liberated, but instead, I feel overwhelmed." Mason leaned back in his chair, his eyes thoughtful, but not pitying. "It's normal to feel lost when everything you've known gets turned upside down. You've lived your whole life following someone else's plan. Now, you have the chance to write your own story. It's not easy, though. It takes time. But the key is to start small. Don't think you have to figure it all out right away." Evelyn nodded, but she couldn't help feeling frustrated by his calm. She wanted to know what she should do, what steps she should take next. She had always been someone who thrived on clear instructions, on knowing the next move, and right now, the uncertainty felt like a heavy fog she couldn't escape. "I understand what you're saying," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "but it's hard not to feel like I'm wasting time. I have this freedom, but I don't know what to do with it." Mason's expression softened, and he leaned forward slightly, his voice gentle but firm. You don't have to have it all figured out. In fact, I think the beauty of this moment is that you get to choose. There's no one telling you what to do or how to live. You're allowed to explore, to make mistakes, and to take your time. You're not wasting time by figuring out who you are. That's the most important thing. Evelyn felt a stir of something inside her, a mix of hope and apprehension. She had spent so long adhering to a plan, following someone else's idea of success, that she didn't know how to give herself permission to just be. But Mason's words resonated with her in a way she hadn't expected. Maybe she didn't have to have the answers right away. Maybe it was okay to take her time. I don't even know where to begin, she admitted. I feel like I should be doing something, working, making money, building a career. But I don't know what I'm passionate about, or what I even want to do. Mason sat quietly for a moment, considering her words, before responding. Sometimes, the best way to start is by trying something new. Find something that excites you, something that feels right in the moment. Don't worry about the future. Just explore what makes you feel alive. You might not find the perfect thing right away, and that's okay. But you have to start somewhere. Evelyn looked at him, grateful for his insight but still unsure. I don't know if I can just explore. I feel like I'm behind. Like everyone else has it figured out, and I'm just floundering. Mason gave her a reassuring smile. You're not behind. You're exactly where you need to be. It's okay to feel uncertain. Just take it one step at a time. You don't have to have the whole road mapped out. Evelyn felt a weight lift off her chest. It was the first time in weeks that she didn't feel the pressure of having to know everything, to have a clear plan. She could take things slow. She could try different things. She could make mistakes without the world falling apart around her. That afternoon, Evelyn decided to take a walk through the city. She hadn't ventured far from Mason's mansion since she had arrived, but something about his words had sparked a desire to explore, to reconnect with the world outside of her safe haven. She dressed casually, a simple pair of jeans and a sweater, and left the house with nothing but her phone and her thoughts. The streets of Manhattan were busy, as always, but Evelyn felt a strange sense of anonymity. No one knew who she was here. No one had any expectations of her. She was just another person among the crowd, free to experience the city on her own terms. The thought was both exhilarating and daunting. As she walked, she found herself lost in the rhythm of the city, the honking cars, the chatter of people on the streets, the bright lights of billboards above. She passed cafes, art galleries, and street vendors selling their wares. Everywhere she looked, there was something new, something waiting to be discovered. She realized that, for the first time in her life, she could choose what she wanted to see, what she wanted to experience. She wandered aimlessly, her thoughts drifting as she soaked in the energy of the city. For the first time in years, she felt like she could take a breath without the weight of expectations on her shoulders. It was liberating, and yet, there was still that lingering uncertainty, the feeling that she was standing on the edge of something big but didn't quite know what it was yet. After hours of wandering, Evelyn found herself in a small park, tucked away from the busy streets. She sat on a bench, watching the people pass by, her mind still swirling with questions. But this time, it wasn't the overwhelming pressure of her past that filled her thoughts. It was the possibility of her future, the idea that she could shape it however she chose. As the sun began to set, painting the sky with soft hues of pink and orange, Evelyn took a deep breath. She wasn't sure where this journey would take her, but for the first time, she felt ready to take the next step. When she returned to Mason's house that evening, she felt lighter, as though the city had given her something she hadn't expected, a sense of freedom, a glimpse of what could be. She wasn't sure of the details yet, but she was beginning to see a future where she could finally live for herself, not for anyone else's expectations. Mason was sitting in the drawing room when she returned. He looked up from his book as she entered, and there was a quiet understanding in his eyes, as if he knew something had shifted in her. "How was your walk?" he asked, his voice warm and easy. Evelyn smiled, a genuine smile, free from the weight she had been carrying. It was exactly what I needed. Mason nodded, his gaze softening. I'm glad. You're not alone in this, Evelyn. You have all the time you need to figure things out. But just remember, you're allowed to take it slow. You're allowed to figure it out on your own terms. Evelyn felt a deep sense of gratitude for his unwavering support, but more than that, she felt a growing sense of hope. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she could walk it. Evelyn spent the next several days in a state of quiet reflection. She had wandered the streets of Manhattan, visited art galleries, and explored corners of the city she had never paid attention to before. With every step she took, she felt the weight of her past life slipping further and further away. But still, despite the peace she found in the city's rhythm, there was a part of her that couldn't let go of the anxiety that had been her constant companion for so many years. It was as if, after a lifetime of pleasing others, she was unsure of how to please herself. Each morning, she woke up with a sense of quiet determination, and each night, she went to bed with a twinge of doubt. She was free, yes, but it was an unfamiliar kind of freedom, one she had never had the chance to explore. The life she had imagined for herself felt both distant and close, like a dream she couldn't quite reach but could still feel the edges of. The mansion, with its quiet elegance, had become both a sanctuary and a reminder of the life she was trying to escape. She had grown accustomed to its stillness, to the way Mason seemed to move through it with an effortless grace. His home felt like a reflection of him, calm, ordered, and assured. But it also felt like a place where Evelyn could build something new, something undefined, and it was that thought that both comforted and terrified her. One afternoon, Mason invited her to join him for lunch in the garden. She had been spending a lot of time alone, walking through the mansion or sitting by the window, thinking through the various options before her. She hadn't asked for help because, in truth, she wasn't sure what kind of help she needed. But Mason, always perceptive, had a way of knowing when she was sinking into herself, when the quiet was turning into something darker. When Evelyn stepped into the garden, she found Mason sitting at a small table, a light breeze rustling the leaves of the trees around them. The sun was high in the sky, casting long shadows on the ground. Mason looked up as she approached, his gaze softening when he saw her. There was a calmness in the way he looked at her, as though he saw beyond her uncertainty, beyond the walls she had built. "I hope you don't mind," he said, gesturing to the seat across from him. "I thought we could take a break from everything. Just relax for a bit." Evelyn smiled, grateful for his invitation. She had been so wrapped up in her thoughts, in her own head, that she had almost forgotten what it was like to simply exist without a heavy burden pressing down on her. Sitting across from Mason, she could feel the weight of her worries begin to lessen, if only slightly. There was something about his presence that made the world seem more manageable, more navigable. As they ate, their conversation meandered between casual topics, the books she had been reading, the art in his collection, her thoughts on the city. She found herself talking more openly than she had expected, her voice more relaxed. With Mason, she didn't feel like she had to be anyone other than herself. He listened, truly listened, and didn't push her to explain everything all at once. "Sometimes, I feel like I'm standing still," she said after a moment of silence, her voice quieter. "Like I'm stuck between who I was and who I could be. It's like I'm afraid to take the next step, even though I know I can't stay in the past forever." Mason's expression softened, and he leaned back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful. "That's the hardest part, isn't it? The fear of what might come next. But you've already done something incredibly difficult, Evelyn. You've chosen to change your life. That's not something most people ever do." "I don't feel strong," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "I feel like I'm drifting, like I'm waiting for something to happen to show me the way." "Sometimes, waiting is a part of it," Mason said, his tone measured, but warm. "But you also have to take action. You're at a crossroads, and it's not going to be easy. The hardest thing is letting go of the past long enough to see what's in front of you." Evelyn looked at him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of uncertainty, any hint that he didn't believe in her. But all she saw was confidence. And perhaps, more than anything, what she saw in his eyes was the belief that she could find her way, if only she had the courage to walk it. "What do you think I should do?" she asked before she could stop herself, her voice quiet with the weight of the question. Mason paused, his eyes never leaving hers. He seemed to consider the question carefully, as though he understood the gravity of it. "I think you already know what to do, Evelyn. You just need to trust yourself enough to take the leap." She frowned slightly, unsure. "But how? What if I fall?" "You might," Mason said, his voice calm and reassuring. "But falling isn't the end. It's just part of the journey. You won't always have everything figured out, and you won't always make the right choice. But you'll never know unless you try." His words echoed in her mind long after their conversation had ended. That evening, Evelyn sat alone in the library, looking out the window at the city below. The skyline seemed to shimmer with possibility, but it also felt overwhelming. She didn't know where to start. She didn't know if she was ready to take that next step, to truly let go of the life her parents had built for her. But Mason's words lingered in her mind, like a gentle nudge toward the unknown. She had spent so many years living for someone else's vision of success, of happiness. It was as though she had spent her entire life looking at the world through a foggy window, never truly experiencing it for herself. And now, for the first time, she could see the outlines of a path, an unclear, unmarked path that she could make her own. It was terrifying. But maybe that was the point. Maybe she had to let go of the need to control everything and embrace the messiness of life. The next morning, after a restless night of thinking, Evelyn decided to take a small step. She called Mason, asking if they could go out to see a new exhibit at a local gallery. It was a simple request, but for Evelyn, it felt like a declaration, a step toward rejoining the world, toward seeing something beyond the walls she had built around herself. Mason agreed immediately, and they set off to the gallery later that day. As they walked through the exhibit, talking about the art and exchanging thoughts, Evelyn felt something shift inside her. It wasn't a grand epiphany, but something subtle. The world didn't need to make sense right away. It just needed to be experienced. She didn't have to have all the answers, but she had to start somewhere. And today, that was enough. As they left the gallery and walked through the busy streets of Manhattan, Evelyn felt lighter. She didn't know what the future held, but she was no longer afraid to walk toward it. She wasn't alone anymore. And that, more than anything, gave her the courage to take another step. Mason's steady presence had given her something she had never allowed herself to feel, hope. She still didn't know exactly what her path would look like, but for the first time, Evelyn was ready to walk it. Evelyn's life in the weeks following that afternoon at the gallery was a delicate balancing act. She had made peace with the fact that she didn't have it all figured out, but that didn't make the uncertainty easier to bear. Each day felt like a step forward, but there were moments when she still felt trapped by the expectations of her past. She had begun to embrace her newfound freedom, but it was a freedom that was still somewhat foreign to her, a freedom that had no roadmap, no set destination, only possibilities. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. Mason had continued to be a quiet presence in her life, offering guidance when she needed it, but never pushing her to make decisions before she was ready. He had given her the space to explore, but in a way that made her feel supported, not abandoned. She wasn't sure where their relationship stood. It was something that hadn't been defined, at least not in the traditional sense. But the more time she spent with him, the more she realized how much she had come to rely on him. He wasn't just a stranger who had offered her refuge, he was someone who saw her, truly saw her, without judgment, without a hidden agenda. One evening, Mason invited her to join him for a dinner party at a friend's house. Evelyn hesitated at first. The idea of attending a social gathering, especially one where she knew very few people, made her anxious. She had spent most of her life being thrust into the limelight, her every move watched and analyzed. But Mason reassured her, saying that it would be a small gathering of friends, and that he thought it would be good for her to step outside the confines of the mansion, if only for an evening. "Just think of it as another step forward," he said, his voice soft but convincing. "You don't have to talk about anything you don't want to. Just enjoy the evening, see a new side of the city, and be yourself. That's all I'm asking." And so, with a deep breath, Evelyn agreed. She spent the next hour getting ready, selecting a simple but elegant dress that made her feel both comfortable and put together. The house they were heading to was a beautiful brownstone in the heart of Manhattan, with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city skyline. It was the kind of place she had always thought she wanted, a perfect blend of luxury and sophistication, but as she walked up the steps toward the door, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was stepping into a world that no longer felt like hers. When they entered the party, she was immediately struck by the contrast between this crowd and the one she had grown up with. These people weren't concerned with appearances, with the right connections or the right brands. They were just people. She didn't feel the usual pressure to perform, to put on a facade of politeness or wit. For the first time in a long time, Evelyn felt like she could simply exist in the moment, without constantly monitoring her every word and action. Mason led her through the crowd, introducing her to a few of his friends, but there was no pressure to engage deeply. He made sure she was comfortable, checking in occasionally, offering her a drink, or pulling her aside to talk quietly if the conversation got too loud. There was a sense of ease between them, a subtle understanding that didn't require words. Mason had always been someone who let others move at their own pace, and tonight, Evelyn found herself moving more freely than she had in years. As the evening wore on, Evelyn found herself standing by the window, looking out over the city. The lights twinkled below her, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of quiet wonder. This was the life she had never allowed herself to fully experience, the life of choice, of freedom. The life where she wasn't tethered to anyone's expectations but her own. "Mason told me you're new to the city," a voice interrupted her thoughts, and she turned to find a woman standing beside her. She was in her early 30s, dressed in a chic black dress that perfectly complemented her poised demeanor. She had a friendly smile, but there was a hint of curiosity in her eyes. "I can tell you're not exactly from around here. How are you finding it so far?" Evelyn hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to answer. She had spent most of her life avoiding personal questions, never really allowing people to get too close. But tonight, with this woman's genuine interest, she felt an unexpected impulse to be honest. "It's overwhelming, actually. It's everything I never imagined, and yet, nothing like I thought it would be." The woman nodded, as though she understood exactly what Evelyn meant. "I get that. It's a strange city, isn't it? You come here thinking you have it all figured out, and then life has a way of throwing you curveballs. But I think it's also a place where you can truly reinvent yourself." Evelyn smiled softly. It was exactly what Mason had told her, but hearing it from someone else, someone who was a stranger but seemed to see her so clearly, felt comforting. "I guess that's what I'm trying to do," Evelyn admitted, her voice quiet. "Reinvent myself. I've spent so much of my life being what everyone else wanted me to be. But I don't know how to be anything else." The woman studied her for a moment, her eyes assessing, but not in a judgmental way. "You're not alone in that. It's easy to get caught up in other people's ideas of who you should be. But the truth is, you're already on your way. Just by being here tonight, you've taken the first step." Evelyn didn't know what to say, so she simply nodded, her gaze drifting back to the skyline. She felt something shift within her, as if the world she had been trying to escape was finally starting to make sense. She wasn't running away from who she was becoming someone new, someone entirely her own. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of conversations and laughter, and Evelyn found herself connecting with people she never would have expected to find in her old world. These were people who didn't care about her family's wealth or her social standing. They weren't interested in who she knew or what she had. They simply wanted to know who she was, what she thought, what she felt. And for the first time in a long time, Evelyn realized that she had something to offer beyond her family's name. By the time Mason and Evelyn left the party, it was late, and the streets were quieter than they had been earlier. They walked side by side, the night air crisp against their skin, and Evelyn felt a sense of peace that she hadn't felt in years. "Thank you for bringing me tonight," she said, her voice quiet but sincere. "I didn't think I would enjoy it, but it felt good. I think I needed this." Mason glanced over at her, his expression thoughtful. "I'm glad. You've been holding on to so much for so long. It's time to let go, Evelyn. And not just of the past, but of the idea that you have to live up to someone else's expectations. You're allowed to live for yourself." As they walked in silence for a moment, Evelyn reflected on his words. She wasn't sure if she was ready to leave everything behind completely, but tonight had shown her that it was possible. She didn't need permission to be herself. She didn't need to ask for approval. All she had to do was step into the life she was meant to lead. And that, for the first time, felt like the most powerful thing she could do. The days that followed the dinner party felt like a turning point in Evelyn's life. She had spent so much time thinking about what she had left behind, but after spending an evening surrounded by people who didn't care about her last name or her family's wealth, she began to see her life in a new light. The world she had always known, full of expectation, responsibility, and obligation, felt distant. It was still there, but she no longer felt trapped in it. She had found something new within herself that gave her the courage to let go of the past. Mason's steady presence continued to be a source of comfort. He had a way of making her feel like she didn't need to rush or have everything figured out. For once, Evelyn realized that she didn't have to be in control all the time. She didn't need to force herself into a mold that wasn't hers to begin with. Mason never judged her, never told her what to do, but instead let her take things at her own pace. The mansion had begun to feel more like home, not because it was grand or luxurious, but because it was a space that allowed her to grow, to change, and to become someone she could be proud of. She had found a corner of herself that had been buried under years of expectations, and now it was slowly rising to the surface, like a seed breaking through the soil after years of dormancy. Still, as much as she had embraced her new life, there were moments when the past crept back into her thoughts. She would find herself thinking about her family, about Blake, and wondering if she had made the right decision. She missed the comfort of her parents' home, even though it was the very place that had made her feel so suffocated. It was a strange, complicated feeling, one that made her question whether she was doing the right thing by walking away from everything she had known. One afternoon, as she sat in the garden with a book in her lap, she found herself staring at her phone, the familiar weight of it in her hand. It had been weeks since she'd last answered any of her parents' calls or messages. The guilt had been eating at her, and now, as she looked at the screen, the urge to reach out was almost overwhelming. Mason had always encouraged her to take things slowly, to be kind to herself. But the fear of hurting her family, of disappointing them, was still present in her mind. She had spent her whole life trying to live up to their expectations, and now, there was a part of her that wondered if she was being too selfish. She glanced over at Mason, who was sitting nearby, flipping through a stack of documents for work. His presence was calming, as it always was, but even his steadiness couldn't quiet the storm inside her. She wanted his advice, but she also didn't want to burden him with her emotional turmoil. She had come so far, and yet, she still felt the weight of the past pulling at her. "Mason," she said, her voice uncertain. "I'm not sure what to do." He looked up from his papers, setting them aside as he turned his full attention to her. "What's on your mind?" She hesitated, then finally spoke. "I've been thinking about my family. They've been calling, sending messages. I haven't responded. I don't know if I should." Mason didn't rush to answer. Instead, he gave her the time she needed to sort through her emotions. He didn't push, didn't tell her what she should do. He simply listened. "You don't owe them anything," he said finally, his voice calm and steady. "I know it's hard. But you've made a choice for yourself, Evelyn. And that choice doesn't mean you have to cut ties completely, but you don't have to sacrifice your happiness for their peace of mind either. They're your family, but you're allowed to live for yourself. Evelyn nodded slowly, her eyes still focused on the phone in her hand. It felt like a lifeline to her past, something she had been so connected to, so tethered by. But now, it also felt like a chain, something that kept her bound to a life that no longer fit her. I don't want to disappoint them, she said softly. But I don't know if I can go back to what it was. I don't even know if I want to. Mason stood up, walking over to her and sitting beside her on the bench. He placed a hand on hers, his touch warm and reassuring. You're not disappointing anyone by choosing yourself, Evelyn, he said, his voice firm but gentle. It's not easy, but you have to be true to yourself. You can't live your life for anyone else. Not anymore. Evelyn felt a knot in her stomach loosen as his words sank in. She had spent so much of her life trying to please others, but now she realized that she had no obligation to live for anyone but herself. She had the power to shape her own future, and for the first time, she believed she could. That evening, after much contemplation, Evelyn decided to reach out to her parents, not to apologize, but to explain. She didn't want to sever ties, but she needed to set boundaries. It was a hard conversation, one that required a lot of courage, but Evelyn knew that it was a conversation she had to have. She composed a message to her mother, explaining that she had made the difficult decision to step away from the life they had planned for her. She told her that she was taking time to figure things out on her own, to live for herself, and that she needed their understanding, not their pressure. She wasn't sure how her parents would react, but she knew she had to say it. It was the first time in her life that she had been completely honest with them, and it felt like a small but important victory. The response came the following day. Her mother's words were filled with disappointment, but there was also a strange acknowledgement in them. Grace didn't understand why Evelyn had to make this choice, but she didn't press her further. Instead, she asked when they could meet to talk. Evelyn knew that meeting would come eventually, but she also knew that it would be on her terms, not theirs. As the days passed, Evelyn felt a quiet shift within herself. She had taken the first step toward reclaiming her life, and although the road ahead was still uncertain, she no longer felt lost. She had found her footing, and that alone gave her the strength to keep moving forward. Mason continued to be a quiet presence, offering his support without ever pushing her. He didn't rush her through her healing, didn't force her to make decisions she wasn't ready for. But in his steady companionship, she found a sense of security, a belief that, no matter what happened, she could face it. One evening, as they sat together on the balcony watching the sunset, Evelyn turned to him with a soft smile. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "For being here. For believing in me when I didn't believe in myself." Mason smiled back, his eyes soft. "You're stronger than you think, Evelyn. And I'm just glad I could be here to help you see that." In that moment, Evelyn realized that she was no longer defined by the life her parents had chosen for her. She was creating her own future, step by step, and with each decision, she was becoming more herself. The road ahead was still uncertain, but it was hers to walk, and that was all she needed.